This lecture covers discrimination and prejudice. Discrimination is unequal treatment that is directed towards an individual because of their group membership or a group of people that is harmful. And it could be unintentional or intentional. But the idea in discrimination is that you are treating people unequally based on some sort of group characteristic. Discrimination could be based on any system of inequality. It could be based on religion, gender, age, ethnicity, race, nationality, appearance. We could go on and on with that. So even though we're talking about this in a chapter that's on race and ethnicity, you need to understand that discrimination might occur in many different realms. Prejudice is a preconceived notion or a belief that is directed at an individual or a group, and it generally includes a categorical rejection of that group, meaning we tend to apply it to the whole group, and it's not generally subject to change based on new evidence. So when we get new information, we tend to continue to hold on to our prejudices. I think in order to understand prejudice better, it's helpful for us to go through some of the elements of prejudice. Just remember before we do that, discrimination is treatment, it's behavior, it's our actions. Prejudice is what we think, what we believe, our attitudes. So one is behavior and one is attitudes. And let's go through these different elements of prejudice. One element of prejudice is selective perceptions. When we have prejudices, we tend to look for certain things. We tend to narrow our perception so that we find those things. So that if we think something like Asians are bad drivers, or white people can't dance, or women are nurturing, we look for people with those characteristics, and we tend to ignore the people that don't have those characteristics. So this is part of what happens with prejudice. It makes us sort of faulty in our judgments of people, because what are we doing? We're looking to find certain traits in people, and we are ignoring other traits that people might have. So that's selective perception. Another way to think of that is seeing what you want to see. When you have selective perception, you're seeing the things that you want and not seeing things that you don't want to see. The next one would be the ecological fallacy. In the ecological fallacy, what we have is people tending to assume that because something is more common for the group, that it therefore applies to everyone in the group. So when people engage in ecological fallacy, they tend to think, blacks are more likely to vote for Democrats, so all black people must be Democrats, or whites are more likely to vote for Republicans, so all whites must be Republicans, or women are more likely to be stay-at-home parents, so all women are more likely to be stay-at-home parents. What we're doing is we're assuming that because something is somewhat more common for a group of people, that it applies to the whole group. And keep in mind, with both this and selective perception, we are often failing to see an individual's traits, right? We are more interested in what group they're a part of than what their actual individual behavior might be. The next one is scapegoating. When we have prejudices, we tend to scapegoat people. The act of scapegoating is actually discrimination, but in prejudice, when we have prejudices, we also tend to use scapegoating. So in scapegoating, you're blaming another group for your own individual problems or your own group's problems. The classic example of that would be when Hitler blamed the Jews for the bad German economy. When you see people say, I can't get a job and it's all the fault of immigrants that I can't get a job. This is scapegoating. This is saying, I have these problems and here's why I have these problems. And putting it all on another group of people rather than sort of thinking about how that individual person, right, might be responsible for their situation. So when we scapegoat people, that's what we are doing. The last element of prejudice is stereotyping. Stereotypes are exaggerations or overgeneralizations. So when we stereotype people, we tend to exaggerate their characteristics. We tend to overgeneralize about them. So some stereotypes might include things like Gay men are really into fashion. All baby boomers are too old to get it, and they're, beyond their time. It might include things like Asians are smart, or African Americans are athletic. These would be some common stereotypes that we have. And keep in mind, right, they are overgeneralizations. So there are many Asian people who struggle in school. There are many black people who are not athletic. There are many gay men who don't have any fashion sense at all. Believe me, I have a couple friends in that category. So when we stereotype, what we do is we're putting people into these boxes. Some of my students over the years have asked me, well, can there be positive stereotypes? So think about that one that says blacks are athletic or Asians are smart. Those stereotypes to some people sound like compliments, right? But the problem when we stereotype is even if it sounds like it's a compliment, women are nurturing, that would be another stereotype like that. What happens is it still has negative consequences for people. First of all, not everyone in those groups fits into that stereotype, right? And we tend to ignore that. So that would be one problem with it. Another problem with it is that many of those stereotypes have a counter to them. So for example, we stereotype black people as athletic. And the counter stereotype that often goes along with that is that black people are not academically oriented. We stereotype Asians as smart, and the counter stereotype to that would be things like Asians are not creative, or I've heard people say, well, Asians are good at math and science, but they're not good at English. And so what you would see is these sort of stereotypes that one might sound favorable, but it often has a twin or a cousin that goes along with it that is unfavorable. So I would argue that all stereotypes, because they're overgeneralizations, because they don't allow individuals to be individuals, and because they often have these sort of negative stereotypes that go along with something that sounds complimentary, I would argue that they're all negative for people.